Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well and enjoying Next. Just making sure you're all in the right room. This is CST 300. We're going to talk about project creation using Terraform and cost controls. Cool. Little introduction. My name is Ramsey Haddad. I'm an infrastructure cloud consultant with our Google Cloud Professional Services practice. I'm based right here out of San Francisco. Our professional services team works with some of our largest customers to help them migrate their workloads and applications to GCP. I've had the privilege of working with CoreLogic for the past 8 to 9 months in helping them move their services and applications over to GCP. I'm actually joined here with Jim Wolcott from CoreLogic.
Thank you, Ramsey. Thank you, everyone, for coming and attending our session. My name is Jim Wolcott. I'm a principal of cloud solutions at CoreLogic, and my job is to define how we operate in the cloud. And we're going to have a chance to touch on automation and labels as part of that today. Ramsey?
Cool. Thanks, Jim. Just an overview of how we'll spend the next 40 minutes or so together. I'll set the context of the typical enterprise use case. I'll give you some background as far as what Terraform is, and then I'll hand it over to Jim to talk about the CoreLogic cloud operating model. And then we'll actually flip over to a demo of the null label module in Terraform. We'll wrap up and then leave some time at the end for Q&A for you folks to ask questions. I'm sure you must be familiar with the Google Cloud Next app, but you can actually head on over there, tap this session, and as you have questions during our presentation, you can feel free to hit the dory with any of those, and we'll make sure to get to those, as well as live questions from the audience towards the end. So how many folks do we have in the room that currently are in the enterprise space? All right, cool. How many solo developer startup folks do we have in the room? Okay. Can't really add those up, but there's more enterprise folks here, there's a lot of takeaways here that we'll talk about that really touch the cornerstone of enterprise use cases, but also can be applied across different segments of cloud consumption. So what do most of our enterprise customers want as they move to the cloud? Traditionally, a lot of the conversations that we were having with customers a few years ago were around data center consolidation and cost savings. That conversation has shifted somewhat from why should I move to the cloud, is it safe to move to the cloud, to how can I move to the cloud as fast as possible and how can you help me? The idea here is we want to introduce quick wins so that we can actually pull away lessons and start to actually change our behavior earlier on in the process. This allows us to actually drive digital innovation, and we can actually maximize our velocity to move to the cloud. So we want to move really quick. We want to be able to not repeat kind of bad behaviors in the cloud. But by doing that, we need to do that in a very secure, compliant way. So repeatability and control is something we definitely see from our customers. All of our customers want to be able to move in a secure and compliant way and build somewhat of an abstract approach to how they work across multiple environments in the cloud. By abstract, we mean deploying services across multiple cloud platforms in a very predictable way. This lends developers to focus on higher level types of work, and then we can actually reduce the blast radius for when things go wrong. So sometimes things happen to go wrong, and we want to be able to minimize that as much as possible with having the right guardrails and controls in place on your foundations and infrastructure. So I touched on this in the beginning. So cost savings is very much a key driver to move to the cloud, but it's somewhat become part of your point of entry to move to the public cloud. So at this point, we're seeing our customers really wanting to get deeper understanding of their operations, to understand what their behaviors and functions are in the cloud so they can build high-fidelity data models to track that and change those behaviors. So the idea is that we can actually start to realize deeper cost savings and then start to improve and mature our infrastructure so that we can save more money. So how do we get there? What are the typical things that we see in the enterprise space where we can get to a place where we are fully automated, we have an infrastructure as code pipeline, and we're starting to actually take those key aspects of our usage of the cloud and then change our behavior to get more cost savings? As simple as it sounds, it starts with actually defining a set of best practices that your organization sees best fit for you. The idea here is to actually take key aspects such as how you authenticate to the cloud, your identity access management, your security posture, your networking, your logging and monitoring, as well as your billing foundations. Our professional services team works really closely with customers in the enterprise space to help them step through getting started with their best practices. The idea here is to actually include billing as part of your foundation scope so that you have the folks in the room early on that are making key decisions that are ultimately responsible for your spend in the cloud. The idea here is to actually go through a workshop to understand what your labeling schema should look like, make sure that the procurement folks that are building the chargeback for the public cloud have a say as far as what the key and value pairs are that you're actually putting on top of your cloud infrastructure. Then we move into actually defining your GCP resource hierarchy. This is another aspect of getting to a place where you can start understanding your consumption in the cloud. Your GCP resource hierarchy is essentially your organization onto GCP. And there's three key components there: organizations, folders, and projects. And what this allows you to do is group all of your GCP resources in a way that you can query, filter, and then change your behavior against that. The idea here is that when we work with a lot of customers, we go through an exercise to understand how we actually break that folder structure out. A lot of our customers will break out their folder structure based on some development cycle, whether that be a QA, dev, production, a common shared folders project. And the idea is that we can then take this folder structure and then build a common project deployment framework against that folder. There's actually a session later today at 2:10 p.m. called CS2 200 that'll actually step you through some of the best practices and how you actually get started with getting set up with your GCP resource hierarchy. We want to be able to focus on repeatable patterns. So we want to understand what users and operators are going to do most in the cloud. I'll talk about this in a bit here, but project creation is an excellent example of how you can actually start to introduce a repeatable pattern and then build a lot of the best practices into that. So we can start building reusable declarative templates that allow us to scale that foundation deployment. Selecting a tool. So Google wants you as a customer to select the right tool that works for your organization. There's a few key considerations there. One is around the training and skill sets available within your org. So we encourage you to really align the vision and direction you want to take your developer skills. There's a few options there. One is a native Google solution called Deployment Manager that's fully API supportable. With Google's commitment to open source, there's also another tool called Terraform, which I'll talk about here shortly, that also allows you to build your infrastructure as code pipeline and take some of these common patterns and deploy them widely. Now, we have our best practices. We know our GCP resource hierarchy. We have an understanding of the foundations and common patterns. We've selected a tool. Now we want to get into a place where we have extreme automation. So the idea of this is to basically codify all of our best practices in a way that allows it to scale them and remove any single person that's doing manual deployments across the environment. We want to be able to take elements of projects, networks, identity and access management, and security, codify them, and then also treat them just as dynamic as our application code. Terraform. So just going to give a quick background as far as what Terraform is in this context. So Terraform is an open source infrastructure as code tool by HashiCorp. Terraform has this concept of providers. So it allows you to interact with various public cloud sources such as GCP, AWS, and Azure, as well as higher level infrastructure services like Kubernetes. Terraform declaratively defines in a set of configuration files what you want your infrastructure to look like. It'll give you a topology that you can evolve over time and build a workflow around managing that infrastructure. Terraform works in kind of three key ways. There's a refresh, a plan, and an apply. And essentially that refresh is your infrastructure described. The plan is that real world described in the infrastructure in a configuration file, and an apply which actually builds that infrastructure for you. So we take those three elements and then we build a module in Terraform. And a module is somewhat of a black box of infrastructure where you can declaratively define variables and inputs and control the behavior of that module. This allows us to kind of encapsulate a lot of complexity around managing traditional infrastructure. We can take those modules and then publish them to a centralized repository. So we'll talk about kind of how we've structured that at CoreLogic, but ultimately Terraform is an excellent open source tool. I mentioned there's a provider for GCP, so there's thousands of contributors publishing best practices for Terraform on GCP. Now, coming to the project factory. I'm sure many of you are aware of the concept of what a project is, but a GCP project provides a trust boundary and resource isolation for all of your GCP resources. It's a basic resource container for policies and infrastructure in GCP. So we want to be able to take a lot of our best practices, and because the project creation is such an important part of how you control your environment in GCP, we want to be able to take all those best practices and harden them into the creation process. This allows us to stamp out projects in a very consistent, compliant way. As you see here, there's a number of things that happen in this project factory, everything from defining a project in a standard naming convention to attaching it to a shared network, deleting all the default configurations. It allows us to actually go through and associate G Suite accounts to that project. But coming down a bit, it allows us to actually maintain a consistent framework for how we associate projects to billing functions. Associating projects to billing accounts. Something we definitely see in the field is that an inconsistent project build process really prevents us from making sure that we associate projects to billing accounts in an accurate way. So we can accurately describe what labels and what billing accounts we want to have associated when the project gets created. Setting up usage exports, this is just kind of another function here. We want to be able to enable as much metadata about our usage in GCP. So we suggest enabling the GCE usage report and dumping that into a central GCS bucket. Coming into applying billing labels. So one of the workshop items I mentioned earlier around defining your best practices is really around kind of building that label schema. And what we want to do is actually take the set of labels and figure out which ones are mandatory and which ones are optional, and make sure that we incorporate that as part of the foundation build process for projects. With that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Jim to talk about CoreLogic, and then go from there.
Thank you, Ramsey. Okay, so a little bit about CoreLogic. CoreLogic helps you to find, acquire, and protect your home. Some of the services that we have in CoreLogic are like, we provide listing services to real estate agents and brokers. We provide valuation information to lenders, and we provide risk information to insurance companies. We're a global company, and we're on a 3-year mission to migrate all of our applications and products to the Google Cloud platform. So we've been working with the professional services organization in that endeavor, and they've been fantastic, especially as we've been pushing the envelope in some areas and engage with their engineering teams and product managers. Ramsey asked me to post a couple bullets about why we chose the Google Cloud platform. And CoreLogic, at its heart, is a data company. We have an enormous amount of property data detail, which we leverage in all of our products and services. The Google technologies are very synergistic with this, and so it's a perfect match for CoreLogic from that standpoint. And the other thing is the Google Cloud platform is really easy to automate. And I know there's a number of CSPs out there that you can apply automation to, but in this case, we're going to talk about the entire environment from the organization down and how easy it is to automate the entire thing. So, what problem are we trying to solve? How many people here are motivated to go to the cloud for the sake of the agility that the cloud offers? I assume most everyone, right? And how many want to achieve cost savings? Well, we want them both, don't we? Right? And that's the problem we're trying to solve, is to derive the highest value out of cloud computing. But it's challenging in that most of us are coming from a static environment and going to a dynamic one. And while that dynamic environment gives us the agility we're seeking, it also raises new concerns, things like security, how do you support fast-paced environment like that, and also how do you apply cost controls into that environment. So what is the solution to that? We have to balance all those things. The need for the controls, but also to enable our cloud development teams to do what they are there to do, which is create products and innovate and be agile. So what we did is we gathered around and came up with some best practices or principles, right, around which we apply to everything that we're doing. First of which is automate everything. Everything that we possibly can. But in that automation, we also build in security, both in the foundation, on the IaaS side, also in our pipelines. So we, pursue the goal of shifting left in our pipeline management to try and test everything up in the build area, including vulnerability testing. We also embrace agility and change, moving from an environment where we have a manual CAB approval mechanism to one where we want to have much more change, smaller changes, right, but many more changes. So we need to have the automation in there as well and the way to track the evidence of those changes. We also have a philosophy in this best practice around you build it, you own it. And what's great about that is as we transform and our application teams gather around that goal and that best practice, it gives us the ability to be able to federate out the support. So we birthright monitoring and logging, and we're able to actually send the alerts straight back to the application development team. They're able to resolve incidents more quickly, increasing the availability of the products and services that we have. So how do these best practices manifest themselves in our CoreLogic GCP environment? We started in July last year, and we set out with the first goal to automate the environment from the organization down. We produced a factory for the network, which is a global network, produced a factory for our identity and access management permissions and privileges. We produced a factory for managing firewall rules, and then we produced the cornerstone of the entire environment, which is the project factory. Now the project factory, which we're gonna show some code around that, has some input points, right, that we have to deliver in to create it. But the project factory is the cornerstone. It provides a landing zone that's hardened. It has a number of features that we want to layer in for every application team that's migrating up to GCP. So if you think about this, we started in July. We automated this organization. We now have 600 projects in the environment. It took us a couple months to invest in that automation, right? But now we can change labels and we can change configurations on projects across the entire environment in 5 minutes. It's fantastic. It's the only way we can really scale. Now, this next slide you've seen before, but it's so important, I wanted to bring it up again. It is a process, and it's important to really nail down this process for the very sake of the outcomes that Ramsey indicated. Speeding up your migration, having repeatability, having that cornerstone of that project built in the organization gives you consistency across the entire environment. So we do things like create the project, attach to the VPC. These are all service projects, by the way. We delete all the defaults. We set up the identity access management security. The next bullet is really important. You have to assign that project to the correct billing account, right? And also set up the usage data that corresponds to that project. And then we enable APIs and we set our labels. So that's the project factory. Let's pivot to asset management. So we've always been taught, asset management is the number one thing we got to do in IT, right? So how does asset management translate up into the cloud? It's a little bit different. You don't have this static infrastructure. You have cloud services. You have ephemeral machines. How is it that you gain the insights into what you have in that environment. Asset management is about identifying, organizing, and allocating, and then being able to take action on those assets. So, what do? We wanted to define our use cases in the cloud and around assets. So we came up with financial use cases and operational use cases, and we defined those labels. And then we assigned those labels to the project at the project level and resources as we deploy resources. That's all tied to billing and usage data. It's the billing and usage data that gives us the accuracy, the precision of what's sitting in that cloud environment down to the second. What else can do that? So that's what we do. We set all this up, and then when the project gets built, we have that default set of labels set up. So if a workload owner is moving up into the cloud, there's already preset labels there while they're working in Sandbox, getting their automation, their pipeline set up, so they can actually apply labels onto the resources they're using and get down to a more granular level, but we have it at the project level. So we, in the labeling strategy, produce these labels, but there's a few requirements that everyone needs to be aware of in going to the GCP. First of all labels need to be lowercase. Okay. They also can't have special characters. So some of our use cases require notifying the owners of those assets. But you can't use in special characters like email addresses, so you have to have a solution that allows for that. We actually strip out those special characters and spell it out, and we're able to then translate that back to the right email address. The other thing to note is as you are reporting on the information coming out of GCP is that BigQuery has all the columns for the labels that you create, but services are running at a different pace from each other and how they're populating the data into those columns. So as some services mature, they have more information being placed out into BigQuery. And so you just need to watch for that as you get into the reporting side. Our top 10 labels here, as I said, financial use cases and operational use cases. We actually have two sets of company and cost codes because on one hand, we want to track the aggregate coming in from GCP, from the billing perspective, the discounts and all that. But then the other hand, we want to be able to allocate out to the workload owners. In the environment, we want to track our migration workloads. So we have an application ecosystem label. We also track the environment, Sandbox, non-prod, prod, the tier, whether it's web, app, data tier, who the financial owner is of those assets, who the tech lead is, and then last but not least is who is going to fix the problems that come up when they are going to be alerted from the monitoring, right? The resolver group. So, want to do a little demo here, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to create the common variables. We're going to go into a null label module, and we're going to then show the project label, project factory module as well. And Ramsey is going to help out and take us to the source code. Cool. It does exist. So what you see here, you see a number of modules. We have, as I was describing, firewall module. We have the IAM module, the NAT, network. But the one we want to begin with is the Terraform null label module. If you open that up, the first thing that one needs to do is declare their variables in the variable.tf file. How many people here are really familiar with Terraform? Oh, beautiful, right? So I'm telling you probably something you already know, but you got to declare your variables here. And as you can see, we have our mandatory labels defined with the data types. Quite simple. Now, as we go into the main file, couple things I want to show. First thing, we do have a reference here to our Confluence page, so that anybody building out a null label file can reference, our standards, our operating standards. And then we have a little bit of work here to do to make sure we conform to GCP requirements. So we set a couple of regex expressions here to help clean up any values that are coming in to the project factory. And we use the kebab case to transform any capital letters to lowercase, and also to change any underscores to hyphens. And since you have a lot of Terraform developers here, you know what the kebab case is. If not, it is a real thing, just like the snake case and the camel case. But we use it here, and the whole point is that we can compartmentalize these variables into a separate module. We can have some of this pre-processing like this. We can clean up the values so that we conform to the GCP requirements. Now, we also reference in these kebab case statements every one of the mandatory labels, right? And once we're done with that, we can go to the Project Factory module. And here's the thing to note is, the very first thing is that we want to reference that null label module, right? And then reference the variables, right, that are going to be used in this main TF file. So we have here reference all 10 of the CoreLogic mandatory labels. And then as we scroll down, we also have information on the project creation that needs to be populated. The project ID, the organization ID, the folder ID, and it's vital that you add the billing account. And then we also have the network that we attach to, and then we reference the label module again here, so that when you run the apply, it's going to pull labels from the right place, right? Okay, so our engineers created this, and they set up a little example for us where we just hard code the values into the label variables, and you can see it here, the hard-coded values going into the 10 labels that we have. Now, this is in the main TF file that would be in the Project Factory module, but we don't do it this way. We use the .tfvar file, right, as part of our pipeline, so we can add a form in front, and automate the entire process. We do that for every one of our modules, right? So takeaways from this is modularize your Terraform code, leverage the modules to be able to separate your variables and variable processing from your main code, and set up a structure, a proper structure that can scale. Okay, so
Flip over.
now you can run your plan and then run your apply. And with that, then Ramsey, I think we would go to the GUI, right, in the GCB Console to take a look at that.
Sounds good. Yeah, we can flip over to the slides, please.
Okay. So everyone's familiar with the GCB Console. You look under the IAM and admin section, and of course, go down labels, and you see the key value pairs. Just that simple. Couple of sample reports we just put together out of this. Number one, we want to look at the aggregate by cost center. And we have a lot of projects that might group up under one primary cost center or chargeback cost center. So we want to be able to see how those cost centers are trending. Second is, in your migrations, you're going to want to track your work packages. And so having that ecosystem ID to be able to identify the package is really helpful in a number of ways. You can see how that package is moving into your sandbox, into your non-prod environments, into prod. Also can see the effect of any of your packages on the shared services projects, such as network or security projects, and you start getting insights into what is happening in your migrations. Great, and so with that, thank you. I'll hand it back to Ramsey.
Cool, thanks, Jim. Yeah. So wanted just to summarize some of the key takeaways from the session. I know we kind of went over this relatively quickly, but it's really important that you set these best practices up early. As you kind of saw Jim describe, CoreLogic had these set of 10 required labels, and the exercises that we actually stepped them through early on was actually go through and build that naming convention, build that key and value pair combination that was not only relevant to the business owners, but that also made it really easy for the developers to interpret and incorporate that into their pipeline. Automating your project build. So this notion of project factory is an excellent place to actually put a lot of your best practices in control. So really look to the project creation to ingest a lot of them, a lot of those best practices as possible. Using billing labels. So one of the things that we commonly see is that either the labels aren't being attached in an appropriate way, or they're inconsistent and actually aren't structured in a uniform way that makes sense to the business. So we want to encourage you to use billing labels, but also make sure that you incorporate those labels into your infrastructure as code pipeline. So take all of these cost governance, your billing approach, your billing account association, and then take that and then really start to apply labels against that, and then make sure that you have that incorporated in your CI/CD pipeline. A few resources to leave you with. So there's a project internal to Google called the Cloud Foundations Toolkit, where a group of Googlers has actually come together and built a standard set of modules in both Terraform and Deployment Manager for things to solve such as project creation, associating labels, all the way up the stack into things such as container deployments and storage, cloud storage as well. Some resources, if you're interested in leveraging these modules, you can actually head over to github.com/terraform-google-modules. And there's an active community, as I mentioned, through the Terraform provider for GCP. There's also an active community within Google building out those modules that fit enterprise use cases. So we want to make sure that in all the READMEs and content that we have, you're able to consume that and figure out how to scale that across your deployments. Great. And so given this is on the cost management track, I wanted to point you to a few other sessions that fit into this space. So there's 12 sessions across cost management. You can actually meet the product and billing product team at the infrastructure zone on the showroom floor. And if you would like to actually see this session and other ones alike, you can actually visit googlecloud.com/cost-management for this video and others.